And when he wasn't attacking NATO or slurring his words or confusing his opponent with Barack Obama, Donald Trump was launching new attacks against Nikki Haley on Saturday, questioning the whereabouts of her husband, Major Michael Haley, who is serving an active duty deployment in Africa with the South Carolina Army National Guard. Take a look at what Trump had to say, followed by Nikki Haley's response.
The greatest president in my lifetime, she said. I will never run against him. Then she comes over to see me at Mar-a-Lago. Sir, I will never run against you. She brought her husband. Where's her husband? Oh, he's away. He's away. What happened to her husband? What happened to her husband? Where is he? He's gone. He knew. He knew.
I need to start with the fact that Donald Trump had a rally today. And in that rally, he mocked my husband's military service. Donald, if you have something to say, don't say it behind my back. Get on a debate stage and say it to my face. I am proud of Michael's service. Every military spouse knows it's a family sacrifice. I have long talked about the fact that we need to have mental competency tests for anyone over the age of 75. Donald Trump claims that he would pass that. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. But if you mock the service of a combat veteran, you don't deserve a driver's license, let alone being president of the United States.
Major Michael Haley also responded on social media, tagging Trump and several media outlets with a graphic that reads, "The difference between humans and animals? Animals would never allow the dumbest ones to lead the pack."
And
wow.
Mike Barnicle, how disgusting. This really reminds me so much of what he said to General Kelly, which is, you know, that soldiers that get killed in combat are suckers, and asking General Kelly, who lost a son in combat, why would anybody do that? Why would anybody do something where they got nothing in return for it? Again, just showing how shallow and how horrible the man is, ridiculing the dead, who dead American heroes. We know that he still ridicules John McCain, a dead American hero. He ridiculed him for being imprisoned in Hanoi for, I think, 7 years, for having the opportunity to come home, even when he was being tortured so badly that he couldn't raise his arms above his head. And John McCain said, no, I'm not going to leave without my band of brothers. I will not be the first out of here. And Donald Trump mocked that. Now he's mocking Nikki Haley's husband, who is in active duty service. I mean, there is a line that connects all of this. And again, I ask those people out there cheering when he's mocking an active duty service person, what's wrong with you? Why do you support that? Why do you support a guy that a judge called a rapist? Why do you support a guy that a jury accused of or found liable for sexual abuse? Why do you support a guy that tells Vladimir Putin, basically, please invade Europe when I'm president of the United States? I won't do anything.
You know, Joe, I might be wrong, but I believe he made those comments to General Kelly while standing at Arlington National Cemetery in Section 68. Which is filled with the graves and the headstones of people who died in Iraq and Afghanistan. Look, I think what we're watching and listening to, including the clip we just played of Donald Trump trying to make believe that Nikki Haley's husband perhaps left her when he's in Djibouti in East Africa serving with the United States military. I believe that we're watching the ultimate hole card that the Democrats have in their hands. And it is the length of the campaign that we are now witnessing. 9 months of listening to this man, 9 months of watching a man disassemble even further each and every day under the pressure of litigation, of having to go to trials where he could be found guilty of a felony, all of that. all of what he says, including what he says about NATO and his references to Ukraine and trying to stop the funding of a fight against Vladimir Putin, ignoring the history of what has happened in Europe over the last century. I mean, this is a modern-day version of 1939. And David Ignatius, unless Ukraine gets that funding, we could be looking at something truly horrific in Europe.
Well, Mike, Ukraine is really on the edge now. Unfortunately, after standing so united in the first year and a half of the war, there are increasing political debates within Ukraine, a country that, when I was last there in October, I wrote was exhausted. President Zelensky has just fired his commander-in-chief, who wanted to have a full mobilization to get enough manpower to fight off what he fears is going to be a new Russian attempt to attack and move west. It's a moment where Ukraine really hangs in the balance. And the idea that this is the moment when this glib, I've been thinking Trump's almost like an insult comedian. He rambles on for an hour looking for lines that will excite the audience. When he would drop this line about he'd encourage the Russians to attack NATO allies if they didn't pay up. I mean, it's just a stunner, and the effect on morale of the countries that surround Ukraine, on the people of Ukraine itself. I've said this in our earlier conversations about Trump. He seems to have no idea of how long it took to build the structure that's NATO, the structure of security, all the sacrifices that went into it. There are several generations of people who worked and fought and cared to build it up, and he just thinks he can blow it over, in a few glib comments. And I fear that he may be able to if his base supports him. But it's just an awful feeling to see this glib, self-absorbed person take down something that's been so important in the world.
Yeah, and Elise, listening to David talking about how Trump could tear down something so quickly that took years and years and sacrifice after sacrifice to build up, people who lost their lives during the Cold War. I'm just so reminded of Edmund Burke, who talked about what true conservatism was and warned of radicals. And I will just say, like Donald Trump, radicals and people that are not detached to reality that can tear down in a day what took centuries to build up. They could tear down foundational institutions in a day that took centuries of pragmatism and compromise to build up.
And they are able to tear down institutions that the foundations are obviously not that strong on, because other Republicans do not stand up against Donald Trump when he's making these statements. And you look at just the mealy-mouthed defenses yesterday on the Sunday shows, and it was just embarrassing. And not even personal defense for Nikki Haley when her husband, who's deployed in a very treacherous part of the world, is being attacked. And it just shows Donald Trump knows nothing about service at all, and he has no respect for anyone who would do it. And you look at someone, Nikki Haley is a powerful woman. She probably could have tried to finagle and maneuvered so her husband didn't have to deploy this year, but she didn't, because she is honorable. And it really is yet another example of Donald Trump disrespecting our national security and the men and women who keep us safe.